So we're on to our first discussion of a real-life chromatography experience. And we're going to take a different direction, and that's one of the reasons that we talk about this method first before we talk about any piece of equipment that we have in our laboratory. And the very first method in chromatography that we're going to explain and that we're going to do in the laboratory is something called thin layer chromatography. All right, so thin layer chromatography is abbreviated as TLC, tender loving care is what we're going to give you. So thin layer chromatography is completely different than what we've kind of described in our previous lecture video series. Previously, we talked about this column, and the column is packed with stationary phase, and that has mobile phase that goes through it. However, thin layer chromatography does not use a column. That's kind of surprising to most people, but in a way it still uses a column. It's just not a round column. It's not a burette looking column. It's something that's structured a little differently, but it still does the same thing as chromatography does. We still have mobile phase, we still have stationary phase, we still have migration through the stationary phase of our components in the mixture. The setup is just a little different than everything else that we'll talk about this semester. So we might as well get kind of the redheaded stepchild out of the room a little bit and go ahead and talk about this one that is a little different than everything that we've discussed so far. And that way you can kind of be smooth sailing from this point on in the semester after we take care of thin layer chromatography. All right. So, thin layer chromatography also goes by another name, and this other name is called planar chromatography. And planar chromatography, when you think of plane, you might think of flat, right? And that's exactly what's going on in a laboratory when you use TLC. You're using flat pieces of stuff versus a cylindrical column. So I'm going to say that it's the only chromatography setup that doesn't use a column, at least in this course that you'll experience, and in a traditional laboratory, what you'll experience as well. Now, it's still called chromatography. So over here to the right-hand side, I'm going to put it still uses mobile phase, and it still uses stationary phase, and it still separates. Okay, so the whole basic of chromatography is still here. It's just going to look a little different to us when we do it. Okay, so before we start talking about thin layer chromatography or TLC, we need to talk about why. Why would we actually do this method if it is so different than everything else that's out there in the lab? All right, so number one is that it is cheap. And we love cheap, right? Anytime we can save money in a laboratory, we're going to choose those methods so that we can do them. So if we can save money, and if I don't have to pay out as much money to do the test with, then maybe that's more profit that the company can make, and maybe that's higher salaries that their employees can make. So they are typically cheap methods to do, and it doesn't take a lot of time, effort, or energy in order to accomplish them. Next, they are very sensitive. So, meaning that if it separates in TLC, it's probably going to separate in other chromatography systems as well. There's no drawback as far as will it separate, yes or no? Well, it's kind of smudgy and I don't really know what's going on, or it's coming off in a clump. There's none of that. If it works in TLC, it's going to work in the other chromatography systems as well. So the sensitivity is not pulled back any at all in a TLC laboratory objective. Third is that these things are very fast. right? So I don't have to wait forever for these things to separate and come off one component at a time. They really do take the separation, and it really happens pretty quickly within an hour or less. And in some of our methods, we're looking at 30 minutes or less for the separation to take place. So it's cheap, it's fast, and it's sensitive, just maybe like a drive-through window, right? Now, the question here is that, are there drawbacks? And the answer is yes, there is a drawback that's associated with TLC, and that drawback is that most of the time we cannot quantitate the components, meaning that we can't calculate concentrations of anything. What we can do is that we can separate things, and we can see the separation, and maybe we can isolate the separation as well. But as far as actually using TLC to make a calibration curve, to go in and solve for an unknown concentration of a sample, that's just not going to happen with TLC. It's qualitative only. Now, there are a few exceptions that are maybe out there that's a little bit more fringe, that you're not going to see in a working laboratory most of the time, that really spins this argument on its head, because there have been moves to make TLC quantitative. And we'll mention some of those when we get to that point. But for now, and overall, we're going to say it's qualitative only. That's it. No more. Will it separate? Yes or no. And we're not going to do any kind of calibration curve calculation with TLC. Okay? All right. So that's an intro to thin layer chromatography. Now, we need a picture of what thin layer chromatography is all about, right? I'm saying that thin layer chromatography doesn't use a column. We call it planar chromatography because it's flat. So what does this stuff look like? So what you see on the screen is a picture of a TLC, or thin layer chromatography, just one version. There's different variations that are out there, but what you're seeing there is one version. So if you've noticed, it looks like a very thin strip of paper on your computer screen. And these things can be made out of paper. That is true. Just coffee filter paper would be classified as thin layer chromatography. But there's other variations that these strips can come in. And we'll talk about these variations a little bit later on, but this is the overall concept of thin layer chromatography, okay? You're seeing a flat piece. It could be a piece of paper or it could be a piece of glass. And this white stuff is basically the stationary phase that we would put into our column if we were making an actual column itself. And then our sample is injected onto the stationary phase, and the TLC requires mobile phase. So it sucks up the mobile phase from one end to the next, and what will begin to happen is that mobile phase will begin to push my sample through the plate or through the strip of paper that I'm using in TLC. So the overall concept of chromatography is still there, right? Mobile phase still does the job that it's always done. Stationary phase still does the job that it's always done. The difference is that it's not using a column. It's not using one of those glass burettes. It is a flat piece of paper or a flat piece of glass that has stationary phase on it, and that stationary phase behaves the same as it always has. That's the only difference here. So again, we'll start talking about the differences. We'll start talking about the TLC variations and what we can expect throughout this lecture video series. But there's an introduction to thin layer chromatography. So in our laboratory, what will happen is that you probably currently are doing, or you will have completed already, a normal column chromatography experiment that you have actually packed yourself. Then we're going to follow up with that with a TLC laboratory experiment. So that way you can at least run a TLC plate one time in our laboratory. And after that, we're going to kind of not do TLC or handmade columns anymore, but we're going to focus on our instrumentation for chromatography instead, which is really the most common that's out there. So stay tuned. There's way more to come with TLC. This to kind of get your feet wet with the TLC world, and I'm going to give you a lot of TLC when I grade your exams for this piece. I promise.